Hello and welcome to another tutorial video. This time we're going to be discussing PowerPoint and covering macros and VBA. This is a topic on this channel that we haven't really gone into in a few years. I want to return, and in this tutorial I am going to give you a simple macro, an extended macro that you can use to swap shapes or swap multiple shapes in PowerPoint. But I want to start by explaining the motivation, why we're going back to this topic of PowerPoint and VBA and macros now, and also explain how and why macros could actually be useful in PowerPoint. So for all the files and resources in this lesson, go to breakingintowallstreet.com/kb/powerpoint/macros-in-PowerPoint. You can see the URL on screen and click it in the presentation notes. I'll also leave a link to it right below this video, so you can just click on it and navigate there. Or just Google BIWS macros and PowerPoint and you should arrive on the same page. But all the files and resources, the notes, the finished macros, all of that are on this page. So I've just spent the past 6 months working on a new version of our PowerPoint training, and I spent about half that time, maybe 2 to 3 months, just adding VBA and macros to the course, including a full macro package. It's similar to what a lot of the large banks use, and also similar in some ways to other paid packages that are available. I have some of the features on screen right now. You can see that we have things like copying and pasting table formatting, distributing shapes across wider and taller shapes, stacking shapes vertically and horizontally, aligning and distributing shapes between drawing guides rather than just other shapes. So there are a lot of features like this that'll be useful and that will save you time in PowerPoint, especially once you already know the fundamentals of the program. Now, I mentioned this to a friend when I was about midway through the process, and he gave me the same reaction that a lot of people do when I talk about this topic, which is, wait a minute, you can use VBA and macros in PowerPoint? Why? How are they useful? Isn't it a bit like overkill if you're just making some simple slides in the presentation? Why do you really need to automate the process if you're just adding some text and shapes and company logos to a slide, for example? The short answer here is that they can save you a lot of time, but you really need to know the fundamentals of PowerPoint and slide and presentation creation first. It's sort of the same with any other automation tool, whether it's AI, something like ChatGPT or Copilot for programming. Yes, all these types of automation tools can save you time, but you need to understand the actual task or the program first, because you can't automate your job unless you actually understand your job first. So before you go down the rabbit hole of exploring all these tools and ways to save time, you need to make sure you understand the basic structure of presentations and all the core commands and shortcuts first. So as a few quick examples of how these types of macros can save you some time, I'm going to show you a few features related to tables and object insertion so you can see how they can shave minutes and even more than that off the time required to create presentations. I'm going to pull up one of our intermediary files here, and I want to go down to the precedent transaction slide. So I'm just going to search for precedent and hopefully find it like that. We're looking for the graphical version of this slide, and I'll illustrate the problem. So here's a slide where we're essentially going to paste in some type of bar chart with the precedent transactions. And I have all the company logos down here, but the problem is that, as you can see, they're not arranged very well. They're overlapping with each other, they're the wrong sizes, and I want to put them in this table and arrange them very neatly. What I can do is I can just select everything here, the table and all the company logos. I can go to our macro package, I can go to tables, and then I can click on distribute and fit shapes to table. And like that, they magically go into place. Now, not everything here is 100% correct. You'll see that we might need to adjust some of these manually. Maybe we're missing a logo here and there. So there are still some problems, but we just probably saved about 5 to 10 minutes of work by automatically arranging and fitting these logos to this table. Now, as another example, let's say that we already have some existing tables in PowerPoint, but we want to change the formatting. What I can do is I can take the format of a table like this. I can go up to our macro package and I can go to tables and then copy table formats. I can then go to a table on the following slide and click on it and go up to our macro package and go to paste table format. So tables, paste table formats. Now this one takes a little bit of time to execute because it has to go through each cell manually and copy and paste the formatting, but you can see the results. We just saved ourselves quite a bit of time because it's very cumbersome to actually copy and paste over table text from one to another and then to go in and change the formatting. There are some faster ways to do it, but you're usually going to need a macro to do it truly efficiently. And then as one final thing to show you, let's say that we are looking at some potential acquirers and we want to insert Harvey ball shapes. Now, normally doing this in PowerPoint is quite cumbersome, but if you have a macro package like the one we offer, you can go to Add Harvey Ball, and you can just specify the diameter of your Harvey ball. So let's say we want to make it about 1 centimeter wide, which is 0.39 inches. Let's say we want it to be 65% filled. And then for the colors, maybe we use one of the colors here on the side. So I can say 72, 80, and 89. And now we have a Harvey ball right here. We could have done this manually in PowerPoint, but it would have taken a few minutes. And so if you have to insert a bunch of these types of shapes, a macro package can really save you a lot of time. So that's just the quick demonstration here. Let's go back to the actual presentation. What I would say on this topic is that you really want to focus on learning the fundamentals of PowerPoint, like commands, shortcuts, and presentation structure first. Once you have those core skills down, yes, then you can install a macro package to save even more time. Ours is pretty good, but there are other options. There are free packages and paid packages out there. There are many options, so just look out there and see what you want and what you need. Ours is very much geared toward finance style presentations, but there are other options in the market. Once you've done all this, you know the core skills, and you've been trying out a macro package, and you want to expand your knowledge even more, then you can start learning at least some basic VBA so you can make your own macros in PowerPoint and customize the packages and the programs even more. The key point is that in PowerPoint, there's no silver bullet. It's much more about knowing tricks and incremental time-saving strategies from different tools that together will end up saving you minutes and hours in your presentation. So the plan for this tutorial will be to start out by going through a quick overview of VBA in Excel versus PowerPoint. Then I will show you how to write your first macro for swapping shapes in PowerPoint. And then I'll show you how to extend the macro to swap multiple shapes. So let's say a few words about how VBA works in both these programs first, because we have actually discussed VBA in Excel on this channel before. The main advantage of Excel here is that the built-in macro recorder lets you record actions, it lets you see the code and modify it, and so it's very, very easy to get started. You don't need to look up anything online, you can just start doing things in Excel, you can record it, and then you can see the code, and then you can modify it the way you want. In PowerPoint, there is no macro recorder, so you'll have to do some online research and find code references. You can use some AI tools like ChatGPT potentially to start generating your code, but again, you really need to know the fundamentals of the program before you do that. Otherwise, you're going to get a lot of code that you don't really understand how to use or test. In Excel, one downside is that macros break the undo stack. So if you execute a bunch of macros, you cannot just press Control-Z or Command-Z on the Mac to undo your changes. It simply breaks the undo command. In PowerPoint, this doesn't happen. Undo still works, which is great and saves you a lot of time. The keyboard shortcuts for macros are easy to set up in Excel, and they're much harder to set up properly in PowerPoint. So there are some advantages and disadvantages, but if I had to sum it up, here's what I'd say. Excel VBA is good because if you just want to use some quick tricks and record a few quick macros to improve your speed, it's easy to get started, it's easy to assign keyboard shortcuts, and so in that way, it's great. Now, PowerPoint, in my opinion, is powerful. It arguably lets you do more than VBA in Excel, but it is more difficult to use and test. The fact that the undo and redo commands still work in PowerPoint with VBA and macros is great, but it is more difficult to get started. It's harder to assign keyboard shortcuts. It's harder to import and export. So overall, the usability is lower, but arguably it is more powerful and lets you do more. And that's how I would compare them overall. Now, if you're wondering about how you'd actually use VBA in PowerPoint beyond the examples I just gave, you generally want to write macros that are simple to code for actions that you repeat a lot. So swapping shapes is a great use case for VBA in PowerPoint because it's fairly simple to code, it's not that complicated, and you will use it all the time to save a few minutes here and there. The reason why this is useful is because if you think about it, swapping the positions of two shapes is actually not that easy, especially when they are not in a regular grid-like pattern. For example, to swap these two shapes at the top of this presentation, I would have to take this shape and move it over here, and then select this one and do Alt-1L to align it to the left. And then I have to take this one and move it over a little bit, select this other shape, and then do Alt-1L, and then align this to the left. And you can't even really see that I've swapped them because of how these are arranged. I have to send this one to the back for you to be able to see it. The point is that it takes at least a few keyboard shortcuts and mouse clicks and strokes to actually swap these shapes. But with a macro, you can automate it. You can just select these two and press one button and swap them like that. Something like centering a shape or a text box on a slide is a terrible use case for VBA and macros because you can do it in just two simple shortcuts. It's actually easier than swapping shapes, and it's also not really that common. In finance style presentations, you don't really center that many things on slides in both the horizontal and vertical directions. Something like a table of contents macro is sort of in the mid category. It is useful, it saves you time, but it's actually fairly complicated to set up and test. Let's go into your first macro for swapping shapes now so we can get started with the code and I can show you how to set this up. The first thing you want to do is go to the Trust Center in PowerPoint options, Alt-TO in the PC version or Command comma in the Mac version, and use one of these settings. You either want to enable all macros or disable macros, but let the user actually enable them with notification. So let's go into our reference slides right here, the file that we're going to be using. I'll go to Alt-TO, and then I will go to Trust Center settings. And here, I'm actually just going to change this. It's set to disable all macros, but I'm going to set it to enable all macros. Also say trust access to the VBA project object model. Now, the other thing I want to do is look at the ribbon menu. So I'll go to customize ribbon, and I want to make sure that the developer toolbar or the developer menu is there because we are going to be using this extensively as we add some code to VBA and PowerPoint. You can see if I go up and press Control F1 to open up the ribbon menu, developer is highlighted there. I can click on Visual Basic, and so we are all good. So the first step here is to open the VBA editor. You can use the Alt-LV shortcut on the PC to do this. I don't believe there's a Mac shortcut, so you'll probably have to go there and click on it manually to do this. Then you can insert a module and a subroutine, and we can call it swap shapes for now. So let's go here, Alt-LV, and then here we want to go in and go here and go to insert module. I can call this module something like swap shapes. And then here I can say sub swap shapes. And this just indicates that it is a subroutine or a function or something that we can run, and then it will look at whatever the user has selected and then perform some actions based on that. Now, the first thing we want to do is make sure the user has selected exactly two shapes using if statements and the active window.selection object, which holds the actual objects or slides or whatever that the user has selected. So to do this, let's go in and let's start typing some if statements right here to make these checks. So I'll say if active window.selection. You can see that as soon as we start typing this, PowerPoint pops up with a list of suggestions. So I can say if active window.selection.type, spelled type wrong, equals PP selection shapes, meaning that the user has actually selected shapes, not slides. They're not inside a text box, nothing like that. They've actually selected shapes. Then we want to proceed. We also want to check and make sure that they've selected exactly two shapes. So I can say if active window.selection.shaperange.count equals 2, then we'll do something. Now, if the user has not actually selected two shapes, we need to show some type of error message. So I'll say else, and then I'll say end if, and then here I will put another end if here to end this particular if statement, because if they haven't selected shapes, we don't want to do anything in this case. For the error message, I can say something like message box to display a message box error and say you must select two shapes to swap their positions. So we have that. And then let's go back and see how this works. So let's open up this file once again, and let's try activating this. So let's select this one shape here, and I'll go to Alt-LPM to activate this macro, swap shapes, and then I'll click on run. And we get an error message because we've only selected one shape. Now, if I select this one and then another one, I'll press Shift, hold it down, and left click to select both of them, Alt-LPM, and then swap shapes. Now we don't get an error message. It correctly detects that we have selected two shapes. So that is a bit of an error check. The next thing we want to do is save the first shape's top and left positions in some type of variable. These variables just let us save numbers and text and other things so that we can refer to them later on as we keep writing the function or subroutine. So I'll go up here and I'll say dim temp left as single and temp top as single. So this dim just means that we're declaring variables, and single basically means that we're storing some type of decimal number here. So it's not an integer, it's some type of decimal with a number and then a decimal place and then digits after that. To actually do this, let's go into this case. And then as soon as we verify that the user has selected shapes and they've selected two shapes, no more, no less, we can say temp left equals active window.selection.shaperange1. I'm putting the 1 in parentheses to tell PowerPoint and VBA that we want to refer to the first shape in this shape range, whatever the user has selected. And I'll say dot left to save the left position right there. And then I'll say temp top equals active window.selection.shaperange shape range 1.top. So we're saving the left and top positions of this first shape. The next thing is that we want to change the first shape's top and left positions to those of the second shape. So as you might expect, we can pretty much just copy and paste this part, ActiveWindow.Selection.ShapeRange1.left, and then I can just swap in 2 instead of 1. And then I can do the same thing pretty much here. I can say .top equals ShapeRange2.top, and we have that. So all we're doing is saving the initial left and top positions of the shape. Then we're going in and saying, actually, let's take the shape's left and top positions and set them to the left and top positions of the second shape instead. That's all well and good, but then now we have to change the second shape's top and left positions to the ones that we saved in step 3 from shape 1 before we changed the positions of shape 1. So for this part, we can go in and say ActiveWindow.Selection.ShapeRange2.left equals temp left, and then we can do the same thing for the top position right here. Equals temp top. And if you're wondering why we're doing this based on the left and top positions, right and bottom simply do not exist in PowerPoint and VBA. All shapes are stored based on their left and top positions instead. So that's why we set it up this way. Now, one other thing we can do is clean up and shorten the code a little bit. We can add some error messages. We can also use the with statement to abbreviate many of these commands and properties. And so what I mean by this is that it's a little bit annoying how we have to keep typing ActiveWindow.Selection.ShapeRange. We can shorten that by saying with ActiveWindow.Selection up here at the top. I can then put an end with here at the bottom. I can then tab over all this text. And what I can do instead is, instead of ActiveWindow.Selection, I can just delete that and say .ShapeRange1.left and do the same thing for all these others. So this is not absolutely required, but I think it makes it a little bit easier to read and interpret this code. And it means that we don't have to keep retyping these same properties and the same objects over and over quite as much. So we have that, which means that we're now on step 7, which is testing the macro. So let's go to our reference file here and see if this actually works. So let's select these two shapes, Shift and left click, Alt-L-PM to go to our macros, swap shapes and run, and they have swap positions. Let's try it for something a little less obvious. Let's try these two, swap shapes, and now these have swap positions as well. And then we could try it for something like this line and this gray box right here and go to swap shapes. So I think you get the idea for how this works. We could try it for something like the headers here as well, swap shapes, and know that now those have switched. So this is the basic version of this macro, and although it may not seem like much, we just spent a few quick minutes writing this, and it's actually going to save us a decent amount of time because it is a surprisingly common task in PowerPoint to have to swap shapes like this while maintaining the correct alignment and the left and top positions of these shapes. The last step here is that to preserve this macro, we need to save this file in .pptm format, which means a macro-enabled presentation. So let's go back to our reference slide, and I'll go to Save, Browse, and then let's just go down here and save it as a PowerPoint macro-enabled presentation. And so we have that. And what that means is now whenever we open this file and we go to Alt-L-PM for the macros, we can simply activate the macro that we just wrote. So that's your first simple macro for swapping shapes. Now let's talk about how to extend this macro and make it a little bit better and more robust. So one idea is that we could make this swap multiple shapes by looping through them. So maybe if the user selected 5 or 10 shapes, we can go through all of them and keep shifting the position of shape 1 to shape 2 and shape 2 to shape 3 and so on. We can also swap shapes based on their center positions. So their center horizontal and middle vertical positions, not their top and left positions. There are advantages and disadvantages to doing that, but we could do that as well if we just change the math here a little bit. Another idea is that we could export this macro into an add-in so that anyone can use it in their version of PowerPoint. And I think if you go in and look at this, you can see what I've done here with this BIWS menu. This is effectively a PowerPoint add-in. If you go to PowerPoint add-ins within the options menu, you can see that I've created an assigned add-in, BIWS-PPT-macros. I have all these icons up here. This is actually very complicated and it took hours, if not days, to set up. So we're not going to go into this here, but we do go over this in the full course and show you the outline of how to set this up. I think the best idea here is to focus on the first simple idea, swapping multiple shapes, because we only really need to introduce one new concept to explain how to do this. So let's focus on that and get started. Step 1 here is that we need to change some of the variables and the error checking, and we need to add a few things here. So let's go back to our code editor right here and let's add some variables. The first thing I'm going to do is put dim I as integer at the top, because now that we're swapping multiple shapes, we want to refer to the number of the current shape that we're on as we're doing this. So this I is called a counter variable, and it will track the number of the shape that we're currently on. The other thing I want to do here is, obviously the user still must have selected shapes to do this, but they don't need to have selected exactly 2. They can select 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it just needs to be greater than 2. And that's the first simple change that we need to make in all this setup. One other thing I'm going to do here is change the temp left to first left, because in this version of the macro, we'll be saving the left and top positions of the first shape, but we don't need to save them for every single shape that we go through necessarily. And I'll change this one to first top instead. The next step is that we need to loop through all the shapes the user selected with a for statement. This is called a for loop in coding languages like VBA, Python, etc. And it lets you look at a selection like the objects or the slides the user selected and go through each of them and refer to each of them numerically by number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and so on. So let's go down into our VBA editor and do this right now. I will say for I equals 1, 2 dot shaperange dot count. And then we also need some way to tell VBA to end this. So I'll put a next here at the bottom, and then we can tab all this code over. And so now essentially what this will do is go through every single shape the user has selected. If they selected 10 shapes, it'll go through shape 1, shape 2, shape 3, shape 4, and so on. And we can perform certain actions for each of these based on the number of the shape that we're actually on. What we want to do now is set the current shape's top and left positions to those of the next shape. It's just like what we did here, where we set the left and top positions of shape number 1 to those of shape number 2, except now we're going to generalize it. And it's not going to be for just shape 1 and shape 2, but it'll also apply to shape 2 and 3, and shape 3 and 4, and shapes 4 and 5, and so on and so forth. So to do this, we need to set up an if statement, and I'll say if I, the counter variable, is less than the number of shapes in this range. So in other words, if the user has selected 10 shapes, and we're only on shape 1, or shape 2, or shape 3, or shape 4, anything before we get to the final shape, we're going to take one specific set of actions here. And I'll say, I'll actually go and cut and paste this code and put it up here. And instead of 1, I'm going to say I, and then instead of 2, I'm just going to say I plus 1. So what this will do is when we get to shape number 1, it will plug the 1 in right here, and it'll say shape number 1's left and top positions are now equal to shape number 2's left and top positions. And it'll go through again and say shape number 2's left and top positions are equal to shape number 3's left and top positions. So we have that. Now, we need to handle the last shape a bit differently here, because if you think about when we get to shape number 10, there is no shape 11. We actually have to go back and get the position of shape number 1 and say shape number 10's left and top positions are now equal to shape number 1's left and top positions before we change them. So we need to handle that separately. Let's go back and do that right now. I will put an else statement here, and this will handle the case when we get to the last shape in the selection. The first thing I'll do is take this code here for the temp left and temp top, and I will put it up right here instead, and I'll change this to first left. And then here, I will change temp top to first top, and so we have that. And then I will just use tab to move these over once again. Now we've saved the left and top positions of the first shape right here. And then in this else statement, it's pretty simple. I'm just going to take this code that we had written for the previous version of the macro and copy and paste it, cut and paste it really, up here. And now I can say shape range I instead of 2, and I can set this equal to first left and first top. And so what this is saying is that when we get to shape number 10 in this shape range, whatever the user selected, we go back and we look at whatever the left and top positions of the first shape in the selection were before we change them, and we set this last shape equal to the positions of those shapes. So we have that all set up now. We could do some other things and add some more error checks here, but I think this is sufficient. We don't need to make this super complicated for now. Let's go in and test the changes and see if this actually swaps multiple shapes. So let's go in and let's select something like the market update and summary, executive summary, current valuation, and Jaguar is significantly undervalued. Alt-LPM, swap shapes, and run. It seems like it swapped all their positions. Let's run that again, swap their positions again. And after we run this another time, it should go back to the original state. And let's see if it does that. And now we're back to the original state. And you can do this for anything. You can do this for these text boxes. So if you decide to change the organization of this summary slide, you can go to swap shapes here, and now everything shifts around. You don't have to bother with messing around, aligning this and distributing this manually. It is very convenient to have this type of VBA and macro code that swaps multiple shapes in the way that we just set it up. I'm not going to test this too much more. I think you get the basic idea. I want to now go to a recap and summary of everything that we covered here. So in terms of VBA itself, there are advantages and disadvantages to using it in Excel versus PowerPoint. I think in Excel, it is easier to get started. You generally have to write less code because you can record actions and just modify it. So it's good for quick, simple macros that will save you time in the Excel files you're using. With PowerPoint, more code is required. You need to know something about the language. You need to look up things online. It takes some more groundwork to get started. It's also harder to import and export, but it's also nice because it doesn't break the undo and redo commands. With the first macro for swapping shapes here, overall, I think it was pretty simple. We want to make sure that the user has actually selected two shapes. If they have, we save the left and top positions of the first one, then we set the left and top positions of the first one to those of the second, then we set the left and top positions of the second one to the ones we saved. For extending this macro to swap multiple shapes, the main addition here is that we added what's known as a for loop, where we loop through all the shapes that the user selected. We make sure that to save the left and top positions of the first one, and then for all the others, we basically shift them. We take the left and top positions of the next shape and set the ones of the shape that we're currently on equal to those. When we get to the end, we go all the way back to the first shape, and that's how we set it up, and I showed you how to test it very briefly in PowerPoint. So that's about it for this lesson. As I said, you can go to the URL from one of the first slides here on screen, and you can get all the files and resources. You can get the code and explanations of it right there. But hopefully now you understand how these features can potentially be useful in PowerPoint and how they can help you automate some of your presentations and slides as you use the program extensively.